Canon recently released firmware 1.3.0 for the R5 Mark II, and with it came the return of dual pixel RAW. Now, firmware 1.3.0 had its fair share of pretty big bugs, and it was quickly followed by 1.3.1, which fixed some of them, or at least the most obvious ones to most users, but didn't actually fix all of them. Today, I want to quickly talk about two currently outstanding, at least at the time that I'm recording this on June 24th, bugs that affect people who are using dual pixel RAW on cameras running either firmware 1.3.0 or 1.3.1, although I have only tested this with 1.3.1. And I want to reiterate, in all cases, dual pixel RAW must be enabled. So if you are not a dual pixel RAW user, you don't need to worry about this video at all. You can go watch something else right now. So let's start by looking at what the two problems are, as there are two separate problems that are possibly related in some respects, but probably not the more I've dug into this. Now, the first issue is with how the camera records subsequent frames when you are shooting an auto exposure bracketing set, again, when dual pixel RAW is enabled. Now, what should happen, or at least what I think should happen, or at least what has happened on all previous dual pixel RAW capable cameras like the original R5, is that every image you shoot in the set is a dual pixel RAW image. Now, with firmware 1.3.1, only the first image is recorded as a dual pixel RAW image. All subsequent images in that auto exposure bracket sequence are going to just be standard RAW images. Now, in my testing, it didn't matter how many frames you captured in that bracketing set, so 2, 3, 5, or 7, what the exposure step was, or anything like that. It happened in all of the exposure or auto exposure bracketing sequences that I tested with. Now, this doesn't appear to be a metadata error as far as I can tell, namely the camera detects the subsequent images as being RAW instead of being dual pixel RAW when you look at them in playback mode. They aren't corrupted, and more importantly, the size the camera shows these images as being, as well as the size they end up being when you download them, is about half of what they should be if they were dual pixel RAW images. Now, with that said, this issue only appears to actually occur when using dual pixel or auto exposure bracketing. If you are using dual pixel RAW with either white balance or flash exposure bracketing, then it appears, in my testing at least, that all images are recorded as dual pixel RAWs. Now, the second issue, and arguably the much more significant one, is a hard crash reboot situation that results in data loss that occurs at the end of a continuous exposure set that is started by the self timer. I know, sounds a bit wordy. The most obvious case where this shows up is using any of the self timer drive modes to start a auto exposure bracket sequence. Since normally what happens with this is the camera counts down and then shoots all of the self-timer or all of the auto exposure bracket frames in rapid succession without you having to continuously interact with the camera. And in doing this, the camera will hard lock. Now, I thought initially that this may have been just related to the combination of dual pixel RAW, auto exposure bracketing, and the self-timer modes. However, in further testing, I have found that this is triggered by any situation or time where continuous frames are captured in a group triggered by the self-timer. So specifically, the continuous self-timer drive mode will always trigger this, regardless of any other settings that you have on the camera, including when no bracketing is being used. Now, when I say any other settings, I mean outside of dual pixel RAW being enabled. In either of these cases, At the end of the sequence, the camera will hard lock. Only the focus point will be displayed on an otherwise black LCD, and the card access light will stay illuminated. Then after a few seconds, the camera will hard reset the same way it would if you removed the batteries. You will hear the shutter close, and it doesn't sound like a normal shutter close either. And the top LCD will go blank the way it does when you remove batteries. Now, when the camera restarts, it will still have the settings that you had set before it reset. So, for example, if you happen to be doing this with exposure bracketing, that will be enabled even if the bracketing auto cancel setting is also enabled, which should have turned exposure bracketing off. Now, the really critical part of this is none of the images that were shot while the card or while that camera was doing the continuous drive sequence will have been saved to your card. So this is a data loss situation. You will just not have those images anymore. So what can you do about this right now? Well, currently, at least at the time that I'm shooting this, which again is on June 24th, 2026, Canon has not released a firmware issue or update to address these problems, and that will be the only way that this is completely fixed. Now, there are a couple of things you can do to work around this if you absolutely need to. So the only complete workaround to shooting a full DPRAW exposure bracket is to do it completely manually. That is, you cannot use the auto exposure bracketing function on the camera at all. You must change the exposure manually for each image. Now, as for the crash situation, to avoid it, which I absolutely recommend doing, as it does not sound very good when the camera does this, which I would recommend avoiding just to avoid any potential that something could get damaged. You will have to avoid any self-timer mode that results in multiple exposures being shot automatically. So that's all of the self-timer drive modes when using auto exposure bracketing and the continuous self-timer drive mode completely at any time. Again, at any time when using dual pixel RAW. Regular RAW images, JPEGs, none of that is affected by this. This only applies when dual pixel RAW is enabled. Now, because continuous low is not affected, if you do need to shoot a bunch of dual pixel RAW images, you can use the continuous low drive mode combined with the limit continuous shot count setting to shoot small bursts of dual pixel RAW images if, again, you need to. And these will all be dual pixel RAW images. Now, this is probably only going to be useful if you're doing flash exposure bracketing, because there's really no point in doing white balancing bracketing with dual pixel RAW, but it's there if, that's the sort of deal. Now, if you need or want to delay your bracket or your sequence of images in this condition, what you will need to use for that is an external timer release like Canon's TC80N3. You just can't use, the self-timer modes on the camera, and that's what they're there to do, is delay things. Now, with all that said, I have reported this to or through Canon USA, and I know of at least one other person out there in the world who has done this as well. In fact, they contacted me via email and tipped me off to this problem that got me to start investigating it. Now, unfortunately, while it has been reported to Canon, dual pixel RAW is a bit of a niche feature, and as a result, I really don't know how high of a priority this is going to get in terms of how quickly that this will be fixed. Now, on the flip side, even though this is a niche feature, we are talking about a camera crash and data loss situation, which should also elevate the priority significantly. But either way, there's no telling, and I certainly don't know if this is going to be something that gets pushed out in a point release firmware update in the next few weeks or something like that. So it'd be like 1.3.2, or if this is something that's going to sit until the next major firmware update at some point down the line. That's a decision that's going to be made by Canon's engineering team in Japan, and we just don't, as end users, have any kind of idea what's going to go on with this. But hopefully Canon will fix this sooner rather than later. Camera crash bugs are not very good to have in general, even if there's something that you don't use or don't particularly need, but they do expose the potential in the software that there could be some other things going on. So just the fact that this is crashing should get Canon to look at this hopefully with a fairly high priority, even if the fix doesn't roll out in the next week or two. But as end users, the only thing we can do now is sit back and wait for a firmware update to be released that actually fixes this. That said, I hope you found this useful, or at least interesting. If you did, let me know by hitting that like button. Also, if this kind of thing seems like it might be your kind of thing, please consider subscribing if you haven't already. Finally, if you'd like to help and support this channel, you can help us for free by liking this video, sharing it with your friends, and leaving a comment with your experiences. Likewise, you can support us by hitting that thanks button or buying yourself something you've always wanted from one of the affiliate links in the description below. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.